everyone, I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel Wruble, and this is One-on-One, Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Welcome back to our Parsha series on Matan's One-on-One podcast. Today I'll be speaking with Matan lecturer Dr. Adina Sternberg about Parshat Tetzave, specifically about Rashi's commentary on the Parsha. Adina, it's great to be here with you.
Thank you for having me.
So let's hear about Rashi.
Okay, well, I want to talk about Rashi's character, but I want to do it through the topic of the Kohanim, the priests, and how they were chosen to be the nation's representative, worshiping God in the temple. Okay. Now, I'm not an expert on Rashi. I've learned him a bit, but I'm not an expert on Rashi. But the topic that interests me, and here Rashi comes in, is law and narrative relations. Meaning how the law and the narrative, how they work together. Now, when I talk about law and narrative, there are two main issues in law and narrative. One of them is how does the narrative of the Tanakh deal with the laws? For example, if you have the stories of Shaul and David and Solomon, how do the laws regarding the king work together with the narratives of actually having kings? But that's not what I'm talking about. No, I'm talking now about the fact that the laws of the Torah are presented to us through the narrative, through a story. Meaning we don't have a textbook or a law book. We have a storybook that has in it laws. And it's interesting because we'd expect the Torah to be a book of laws that God gave the people of Israel. But instead, we're telling us a story of how the laws were given, but more surprisingly, we're also told the story of how the laws were formed or how the laws were changed.
So if I can think of an example from the story of the Exodus, so the example where all the halachot are given amidst the story of them leaving Mitzrayim, is that what you're getting at?
Well, I'm saying that we have two things. One is we get the 10 Commandments, right? So the story is everybody came to Sinai and they had to get organized, and then they got a body of law. And the body of law was the 10 Commandments, okay? And then afterwards we have the body of law of Parshat Mishpatim, all the laws that they were given. So those are laws that you have a body of law, you have a text, Sefer HaBrit, or Luchot HaBrit, and they're given, and we hear the story of how they're given. But what I'm talking now is something even more. Sometimes it sounds like the story is what causes the laws to become laws. So if I'm not talking about Exodus, I'm talking, for example, in the book of Bamidbar, we have the story of the daughters of Tzlofchad, or we have Pesach Sheni. And then it sounds like the lawgiver changes the law or updates the law according to the story. So if we're talking about the stories of Pesach Sheni and the daughters of Tzlofchad, it sounds like a certain kind of update, refining of the laws. We're okay with that. But in our Parsha, in Parshat Tetzave, we talk about the dedication of the Kohanim. And that's where it becomes interesting, because we're not talking only about updating the law or refining the law. We're talking about changing the law, or at least according to Rashi.
Okay, so what happens in this week's Parsha that you're speaking about specifically for all of us without a Tanakh open in front of us?
Okay, so we're in Parshat Tetzave, which comes after Parshat Truma. In Parshat Truma, we learned the laws of the Mishkan, and in Parshat Tetzave, we learned of the dedication of the Kohanim. A few extra details of the Mishkan, but especially about the dedication of the Kohanim, their clothes, who they are, which is Aaron and his sons. Now, supposedly, there's no problem. Meaning, if you read the Torah in sequence, you see, we get the Torah at Har Sinai, and then Moshe goes up to Mount Sinai to get all kinds of extra laws. So he learns Parshat Mishpatim, and then he learns Parashat Truma and Tetzave. He learns of the Mishkan. He learns about the Kohanim. He comes down and he's about to give them the Torah, but there's a certain little detour because they've had the sin of the golden calf. But then he goes back to it, and then they make the Mishkan, and everything's okay. So that the way the text is presented, supposedly there's no problem. But Rashi does something really weird. It's not only Rashi in accordance with Chazal, what he does is he says, okay, we're rewriting the book. Like sometimes I feel that the way Rashi tells us of how the book of Shmot is really supposed to be read is like when I had every time I have a new child in the family, you feel like everything you knew about the family is just thrown up in the air, and then it falls
gets shaken
down.
out. It's like the tablecloth. You shake out the tablecloth so then it can come back down on the table.
Right, exactly. So when it comes down differently. So Rashi sort of shakes up Sefer Shmot and he places it down differently than the way it's presented to us. Because the way we see it, again, Chet HaEgel comes already after God commanded about the Mishkan and about the Kohanim. But Rashi tells us, no, the story is different. What happens is that Moshe goes up to Sinai, and then Bnei Israel do Chet HaEgel, and then Moshe comes down, and only when he goes up back again, he learns about the Mishkan, and he learns about the Kohanim. Now, as for the Mishkan, Rashi doesn't say this specifically, but this is how Nechama Leibovich understands him, and this is what it says in a lot of the Midrashim that Rashi is based on, that according to Rashi, had Bnei Israel not sinned in the Egel, they would not have gotten the Mishkan.
Yeah.
The Mishkan is a reaction to Chet HaEgel. And we can explain it in different ways. It comes to atone for the Egel. It comes to, as a certain compromise. You need something physical. You need something you can see. Fine, we'll give you the Mishkan. Mm-hmm. Right? According to this, like if Bnei Israel did not sin in Chet HaEgel, we would not have a Mishkan, maybe even a Mikdash. We would worship God in a totally different way. Now, the second thing that Rashi says is that also the idea of the Kohanim, the sons of Aaron, came after Chet HaEgel. So, of course, he'd need to put Parshat, Ruma, and Tetzave after Chet HaEgel, but he also really explained that this stems from Chet HaEgel. Because in Chet HaEgel, when the people made the golden calf, the tribe of Levi came to punish those who were sinning. Moshe says to him, Mil'u yadechem hayom la'Hashem, ki ish bivnu ve'achiv, ve'latet alechem hayom bracha. He says, you are going to fill your hands or dedicate yourself to God.
Be inaugurated, as servants of God.
And servants of God, because you did this. And Rashi understands from here that this is when the Levim were chosen to be the servants of God, to be our representatives. Mm-hmm. According to Rashi, and he writes this in a few places, those who were supposed to worship God or supposed to be the ones sacrificing for the people of Israel were actually the firstborn, as we see in the story of Esav and Yaakov. The Rashi explains that Yaakov wanted to be the firstborn so that he'd get to be the one sacrificing. And Rashi says that at Matan Torah, those sacrificing were the firstborn. And he says different people were supposed to be worshiping God or being our representatives to worship God. And comes Chet HaEgel, and maybe even the firstborns were part of the sin, and they're rejected. They're out of the game. We need to choose somebody else instead. The Levim who walked up and stood up for the task, they get to be now the tribe that worships God.
So if I understand, you're pointing, your first question, really, the main question, is this idea of, is God, according to Rashi, responding to what the people have done? And the response can also be new laws or new completely radical ideas. The smaller question that underlies this is also this question of chronology, right? That the specific point of how does the Mishkan come in? When did Moshe go up to Har Sinai? The Luchot is also this question of chronology. Is the Torah telling us things in their proper order, or is the order being changed? Am I understanding that correctly? And that's where Rashi says, nope, we don't have to preserve the chronology, right? He has to not preserve the chronology in order for his idea to work.
Definitely, which makes it even more radical.
Correct, yes.
Meaning, okay, everybody knows, everyone who grew up in the religious school system and learned Rashi knows law and mukdam u'meuchar b'Torah. Okay, so Rashi doesn't feel obligated to chronology. Sometimes it's really logical not to be obligated to chronology. Yeah. Sometimes we have flashbacks. Sometimes you can see that the dates don't work according to regular chronology, and that's okay. That's really fine.
There's a choice, the way that Torah is organized, and chronology is not always at the top of the choice.
Exactly.
Right.
The thing is that I'm not quite sure what is the egg and what is the chicken, meaning what came first. Rashi's decision to understand the choice of the Kohanim and the building of the Mishkan to be a reaction to Chet HaEgel. And if so, you have to reorganize the text? Or did he really understand that the text wasn't in accordance to the sequence that it is in front of us, that the chronology was different? He understood that really the whole story of the Mishkan and the Kohanim came after Chet HaEgel. And once he understood that, he also understood that the Kohanim were chosen because of Chet HaEgel. And he understood that the Mishkan came as a reaction to Chet HaEgel. But it didn't scare him. It didn't worry him.
Mm-hmm. And so why does this concern you? I mean, where does this take you? Why does this is something that draws you in?
Okay, well, I find it very interesting because I think, again, this might be part of, the religious upbringing and what you hear a lot in the school system. There's a certain idea of histakel be'oraita uvara alma. God looked in the Torah and he created the world accordingly, right? And this idea of an everlasting Torah that preceded the world and will continue ever after. And this idea of like a truth, a non-changing eternal truth. And in this way of thinking, in this conceptual world, the idea of things being changed, and not only updated or not only refined, but radically changed, that it's very surprising. And especially it's surprising when you read the text as a sequence, it wouldn't come up.
You're saying Rashi didn't have to go down that avenue. He could have easily commented something that was theologically simpler, but he doesn't even seem to be self-conscious about the fact that he's rocking the boat.
Exactly. Meaning, if you can compare, because the Ramban also dealt with these psukim, and Ramban says, okay, first there was Matan Torah, then Moshe learned about the Mishkan, and Moshe learned about the Kohanim, and then he came down, and then there was Chet HaEgel. We have the stories of the Mishkan again? Okay, because we needed to say, we haven't broken everything. We haven't decided that we're not doing it. So we had to say, yes, we're doing it anyway, even though you guys sinned. But the ideas were there before.
Right.
On one hand, you can just say, you know what? These are two different ways of looking at God's choice. Meaning these are two ways of how, if we just look, for example, at the idea of the priests. We have in Judaism, this I learned from Dr. Mordechai Sabato. He says in Judaism, you have two ways of looking of the way God decided to choose the people of Israel, or to choose Avraham Avinu, and to choose the Kohanim. There is the theory that says, people are chosen because they were chosen. God chose Avraham Avinu without telling us why he chose Avraham Avinu. He saw something about him. It was something intrinsic. It was something essential to who Avraham Avinu was, and that's why God chose him, and he doesn't feel the need to tell us why. And for the same reason, God also chose the priests, the sons of Aaron. Why? Because. That's the answer. Lama kacha. Okay? And this is something intrinsic to the Kohanim and intrinsic to the people of Israel and intrinsic to Avraham Avinu. And he doesn't need to explain himself. It's something like internal, essential. Okay? That's one way of looking at it. That's why Avraham Avinu, no one told us why he was chosen. That's why the people of Israel were chosen, even though, you know what, they're not always...
didn't seem particularly worthy.
Yeah, exactly. And the Kohanim, you know what, also, they weren't... The Levi might have been very worthy, but let's just say that Aaron, the Kohen, in the story of the sin of the calf, he wasn't exactly, the model person we would have chosen afterwards. Okay, so that's more or less the way the Ramban is going. The priests were chosen before anything ever happened because the priests were chosen, and that's it. And I think in a certain sense, that's something that we like to hear because it gives us confidence. If you don't know why you were chosen, you can't be banished and you can't be rejected because that's what God chose. He loves us. Why does he love us? Because he loves us. I don't know why. Right? On the other hand, when Rashi comes and tells us, you know why the priests were chosen? Because they were part of Shevet Levi. And why was Shevet Levi chosen? Because they proved themselves worthy. God doesn't choose out of thin air just because that's what came out. But God rewards those who are worthy. So we need to explain why were the tribe of Levi worthy. Here we have a place. It says it even uses the words mil'u yedechem is the words of dedicating to priesthood.
Yeah.
So we know, it makes us feel good that good deeds are rewarded and that we have a reason. It also gives you a certain, if it doesn't give you confidence, at least it gives you some kind of pride. Oh, I know. And then we can go back and start thinking, oh, so why was Avraham Avinu chosen? Okay, so he was chosen because he fought against the idols and the idol worshippers, or maybe because he was the first person who recognized God. Maybe it's because he started going to the land of Israel and he started the Lech Lecha even before God gave him a Lech Lecha. We can give all kinds of different reasons, but we're looking for an explanation. We're looking to say, yes, we were chosen for a reason. We're good, right? It gives us a certain kind of confidence. Lots of us like to go around in the world feeling, we're worthy. The only problem is that theologically, that's also very dangerous. Because if you're chosen because you're worthy...
You can also be unchosen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if the firstborn were rejected because they were unworthy and they proved themselves wrong and they sinned, now it becomes dangerous. What will happen if the Kohanim sin? What will happen if the people of Israel sin? What will happen, etc.?
And again, I'm trying to understand also, and why is this concerning? So you're saying, why is this the part of Rashi that brings you to, that grabs your attention? So let's say, right, Rashi says here that they received this position because they made themselves worthy, because they showed up and did what they did at the sin of Chet Egel. And so where's the radical piece in Rashi here?
Because of the dangerous part of this theology. So even though it's very appealing on one hand, the dangerous part is, why can't somebody come now and say, okay, the people of Israel also sinned. They were rejected. Somebody else was chosen instead. Meaning, we don't want to go that far and give...
He's falling into the lion's den of Christian polemics, basically.
Exactly. Which is surprising. So I want to say two things. First of all, I was really surprised because I know that Rashi lived in a Christian country. Towards the end of his days, he was in the Crusades. And it's surprising that Rashi would give such ammunition to the Christian theology. Isn't he worried? Isn't he scared that somebody might read Rashi and say, hey, Rashi says that God can reject the chosen people or group and choose a different group? Like, wasn't he scared? So here I'll bring in my father, Professor Daniel Lasker. He's an expert on Jewish-Christian polemics. And he shows that even though there are all kinds of scholars who look in Rashi and pinprick, look for where does Rashi say something anti-Christian? Where does Rashi say something that might be polemical, etc.? He says Rashi doesn't do it much. And even when he does it, it's not a deep theological argument. It doesn't seem like he's really interested in their theology and all the intricacies. It's like it doesn't seem he's really worried about it. He's aware of it, but he's not worried about it. Other commentators were much more worried about it. Even the Rambam, who didn't live in Christian country, he was worried about it. He had to make sure that everybody knows that this Torah can't be changed. It's an everlasting Torah. Nothing will change. God gave it once, and he doesn't change his mind. He has to
define the halachic status of Christians in general at that time, meaning the Rambam has overt writings about the Christian world.
Right. And he also deals with their theology. One of the things was the idea that the Torah can change and that God can change his mind and stuff like that. And Rambam won't agree. And Rashi, so we can first of all say, I think this proves my father's theory, that Rashi doesn't really care.
Was he witness to polemics in that sense? Do we know that? Was he living in his time? Was he, again, the Ramban obviously was in the thick of things. Was Rashi, did he live during that time of that Renaissance?
So a little bit later it started. And as far as I know, but again, I'm not an expert on that.
He's sort of right before all that eruption.
Exactly. And here Rashi, so on one hand, you can see he's not worried about it. It doesn't scare him. He doesn't care about it so much. Then, so we can see that he doesn't have this sur mera of picking his commentary according to what might play into somebody else's hands. And then you need to say, okay, but what is good about this theology? What does it give us? And what I find fascinating, even though I myself find it hard to accept this idea, but what I find fascinating is this idea of a dialogue between God and man. Now, Rashi here establishes this idea that the Torah, at least in the beginning, was still a little bit flexible. Not necessarily saying this about later on, but the Torah, at least in the beginning, was flexible. And God, when he decided to give Torah to man, he decided this Torah can be affected by man. He decided that his book is still being written throughout the process of giving it to the people of Israel. You can see it already in the fact that the Torah wasn't given all at once. Right? It was given in portions. It was given a bit in Egypt, and then a bit later in Marah, and then on Mount Sinai, and then in Ohel Moed. And it's being given in portions, like God saving the right to put in changes. And he gives the law, and then he sees how it's received, and then he says, okay, so maybe we'll make it a little bit different. And what Rashi is emphasizing is that the Torah is not only something given down to us by God and, like thrown upon us and deal with it, but Torah was given within a dialogue.
And it was given also in response to the reality in which it was being handed down to.
Exactly. Maybe what turns the Torah into being eternal is not the fact that it's not changing, but actually the fact that it does, in a sense, listen to the reality. Now, I don't think Rashi would agree to change the Torah after it was given.
Yeah.
I think we need to be very careful. Even though Rashi is willing to say, to show us what happened and to explain what happened as a certain dialogue, he would still agree that the Torah at a certain point was sealed. That's not going to be changed. But as a theology, I think it still opens up the idea of Torah Sheba'al Peh, the idea of an evolving Torah, the different ways of understanding it in different situations, the reality giving us new glasses with which we look at the Torah. It gives us a foundation for the idea of Torah Sheba'al Peh as giving a lot of weight for the way people understand things, and the way things are received, and the way... so even if the Torah won't change, we still have a dialogue.
Right. I think you're taking it in the specific context of law, perhaps, but I think that this has tremendous import also for a theological relationship with God, meaning just to take it on the spiritual level, that God, puts things in this world, and we have a tremendous impact on how that manifests itself in the world, and that it's a relationship that impacts both sides, which is something that's funny for us to say because we aren't able to see how it impacts God. But I agree with you that the Tanakh puts forth a certain theology, and, Heschel is coming to mind, and others, where, God reaches out to us and we reach back out to God, and that impacts both sides ultimately. And that you're speaking more in the sense of law, which you're saying makes you uncomfortable because you're saying later on, what does that mean theologically, right? That's what we could talk about, slow revelation or revelation in stages, which is something that has been taken to the halachic world. Yeah. Whether it's through the Rambam or much more recently through other more liberal thinkers. But this idea that we impact what God puts out there in the world, or how it's received, and then eventually how he then continues to contact the world, is something that echoes both on the halachic and the theological and spiritual levels, I think.
It's true, yeah. When you think about it, when the Rambam, talks about the Torah as not being changeable, because God is not changeable, his God is really very aloof and far away, and not one you can have a relationship with.
Yeah.
And when Rashi sort of brings God closer to us, it might make us feel uncomfortable because it sort of humanizes God, even though we don't want to say so. But the idea of change is human.
Yeah.
And if God, I wouldn't say that God is human. I definitely wouldn't. Once a friend of mine asked, she said, how do you deal with theology of God? I said, you know what? There's something I know maybe in my mind. There's a certain philosophical theology that I can think of, intellectually. But I know that the Torah presents itself as something differently. Like God decided to give a Torah that presents our relationship with God as something close. So I don't understand this intellectually. I don't know how it works with a philosophical God. But I know that that's the way God chose to present his Torah. That's an image that he decided to give to us. An image of someone we can have a dialogue with.
I mean, it comes through in so many places. Just think about Chazal's metaphor for all of Shir HaShirim, okay? Meaning is that it's not just that we can have a dialogue, meaning it's someone that reaches out to us, tries to woo us, tries to, that bring us into the relationship. And there's this constant, sort of, running to and fro, where ultimately our desire is to meet somewhere out there, in the fields. But I think that this idea, is so broad ranging, and ultimately, throughout the test of time, the God of the philosophers is not the God that was the popular one, meaning it speaks to the average believing person, not even Jew, okay, but certainly also, they're not looking for the God of the philosophers, the God who, put everything into place and then left it to be. People are trying to have a relationship with God. That's the word you're going to hear. Not, I'm trying to contact that thing very far away, but I'm trying to have a relationship with God. So I think that the intuition of humans in general is something that we should take very seriously. Most people believe in their heart that they can have a dynamic relationship with God, which requires that two-way relational aspect that you're saying also comes through in Rashi's commentary.
Yeah, I agree. You might say that God's reaction to man is deciding to portray him as a God who reacts to man.
Okay, wait, take me through that. 1 second.
Meaning, God may be philosophical, and he may be aloof, and he may be distant, and whatever. But he knows that our need is to have a God that we can have a relationship with.
And therefore he chooses to be that God?
And therefore he chooses to portray himself as that God.
Okay.
I don't know what he is, really.
Okay.
But I know that that's what he decided to give us in the Torah.
100%. The God, the God of, I was recently reading Heschel specifically, and he, in the prophets, and he was writing about how God so desperately wants contact with the world that he'll throw himself on prophets, meaning that is the portrayal you get of God from the Nevi'im. Mm-hmm. They didn't want it. They weren't looking for it. They weren't trying to be prophets, but God says, I want to be involved in this world. So I'm going to put myself there and bring my message to the world because God so desperately wants that relationship. That's how he portrays.
Okay, of course you could also look at it differently. But yes, I think in a sense, it's a very dangerous theologically to have this idea, both of a more human God and the idea of our being able to affect him. But maybe theologically and existentially, we need this much more.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel Wruble, and this is One-on-One Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Thank you to the entire Matan team for their input. Please do One-on-One and Women's Torah Learning a small favor by sharing this podcast with family and friends so that we can reach new listeners. You can stream and download these episodes on Spotify, iTunes, and Matan's website, and write us any feedback at podcast@matan.org.il. That's podcast@matan.org.il. Thanks for listening, everyone.